This is America, where a strategic dilemma is on the U.S. president's plate. He's close to both Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkiye. But the two men's visions for the Middle East are clashing. Syria just proved it. Israel recently bombed a Syrian airbase over fears Turkiye is trying to build a military pact with Damascus. We'll ask just what Donald Trump can do to keep both of his friends happy. But first, let's go into the D.C. studio where you'll find Alex Marquardt.
Thank you, Rosalind. Trump calls Benjamin Netanyahu a friend, and he says the same about Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkiye. Last week, that got tested when Israeli jets hit a Syrian Air Force base that Turkiye was reportedly about to use. For a few hours there, Washington worried about a direct clash between them. Then there's the issue of America's F-35 fighter jets. Erdogan wants to buy them, but Netanyahu wants to block that sale. They're also clashing over Iran and who calls the shots in Syria. None of that leaves Trump much room to keep both those men happy. So let's go back to Al Jazeera's Rosalind Jordan, who explains.
A day after Turkish officials allegedly visit Syria's Abu Duhur air base, Israel launches airstrikes, a rare rebuke from a top U.S. diplomat, an unnecessary escalation. Israel claims self-defense.
We will not tolerate Turkish military presence establishing itself as it moves south. It threatens us. We conveyed that clearly.
Ankara's response: Israel is interfering with Turkiye's efforts to help Syria rebuild.
Our efforts and contributions toward preserving Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and helping it achieve stability and security will continue with determination.
The tension between Israel and Turkiye is no one-off. They're locked in a regional power struggle, and the U.S.'s goals in the Middle East are complicating Washington's ties to two of its most important allies. Turkiye and Israel have incompatible visions for Damascus. The U.S. is struggling to balance both allies. Turkiye says it wants to help Syria rebuild its institutions, train its military, and links its own security to having a stable neighbor. Israel looks north and sees a security threat. It's wary of President Ahmed al-Shara's government. It continues its occupation of the Golan Heights for security reasons. The other complications: the Iran war. Israel wants to keep going. Turkiye wants diplomacy. Netanyahu rejects Trump's plan to rebuild Gaza, a plan Erdogan endorses. And Israel's worried it will lose its military advantage if Washington finally gives F-35 fighter jets to Turkiye, something Donald Trump hints he may do.
Turkey's been in many ways much more loyal than other countries that we think would be loyal. So something certainly we would consider.
Trump sees a rebuilt Syria as key to stabilizing the Middle East. But recent events show the U.S. may have a hard time closing the fissures between Turkiye and Israel, and Syria might lose out in the process. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And here with me to discuss this dangerous balancing act are Frank Ricciardone. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey and Egypt, and Marc Ginsberg. He's also a former ambassador to Morocco. Thank you both for joining me to discuss this really interesting balance of power that's shifting and conflicting. Ambassador Ginsberg, I want to start with you. When the U.S. looks at this landscape, how difficult is it for the Trump administration to keep these three competing powers in check?
Well, there's no doubt that this is a balancing act, because even though Turkey and Israel had an extraordinarily close relationship from the time of Israel's independence all the way through till the October 7th terrorist attack, that relationship began deteriorating both under Netanyahu and under Erdogan, for different reasons. And one of the reasons is the United States has avoided picking sides between the two. There was no reason to. Turkey and Israel were more or less aligned against Bashar al-Assad. Turkey and Israel were aligned when it came to dealing with the neighborhood against terrorism. And Turkey and Israel aligned because they were both pro-Western in their outlook and relationship with NATO. But all of this has changed, and it's gotten not only far more negative, but the acrimony that now is more or less inflamed between the two sides has put Washington in the middle. On the one hand, the Israelis don't want the United States to cozy up to Erdogan.
Right.
And on the other hand, Erdogan is very suspicious of Israel's aims and objectives that are going to harm or are perceived to harm Turkey's interests in the region.
So, Ambassador Ricciardone, you say that Netanyahu versus Erdogan, that Netanyahu is the harder partner for Washington to deal with. Why?
I think so. You know, these countries, if we talk about balancing them, there's nothing symmetrical or even parallel about them and how they see each other. For that matter, the third party, us. We're each very different in our internal dynamics and in the dynamics of the bilateral relationships. As Ambassador Ginsberg has alluded, the Turks, for example, don't see a particular political value. Erdogan, I don't believe, has a particular political value in fomenting enmity with Israel, hostility, preaching to the Turks that we have an enemy and all that. He genuinely dislikes or opposes what the Israelis are, the way they're dealing with the Gazans, the Palestinians in general, and always has. He has genuine grudges going back to the Mavi Mamre and so forth. But the Turks have people in their embassy in Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. The Israelis do not have people in their embassy in Ankara.
Is that right?
It's true. People forget that Erdogan visited Yad Vashem in 2005, the time of Ariel Sharon, and said anti-Semitism is a crime against humanity. How many Arab heads of state, he was prime minister at the time, have visited Yad Vashem while in office and said such a thing? The Turks don't have an intrinsic loathing of the Israelis or fear of them or sense that they would be useful politically to have as an enemy. On the contrary, they're invested in regional peace and stability. From Mr. Netanyahu's perspective, well, I shouldn't speak for him, I don't claim to know him, but it seems that having instability in the region, they have real enemies enough who are ferocious and fierce, but creating this feeling that we are at war with another party can actually have some political value to it. That doesn't obtain in Turkey. You can see ways that they could, despite the venom and the fierce language coming out of both sides, you can see ways that ought to be able to be made to subside somehow. We'll see what happens in elections that come up in Israel.
There is a growing list of items that these two countries disagree about, and I kind of want to tick through them because it's not just the competing visions for Syria, which we're going to get into. Israel also wants Iran completely stripped of its nuclear, missile, and proxy capabilities, while Turkiye wants Iran contained but still intact because they fear regional chaos. In Gaza, Israel doesn't want Hamas involved in any of the security, while Turkiye wants no Israeli control and a Palestinian-led political settlement to this conflict. And then there are the Kurds. Israel sees the Kurdish minorities as potentially useful partners, while Turkiye sees any Kurdish forces as a direct security threat. So, Ambassador Ginsberg, this tension, as you noted, has been rising for years. Certainly the October 7th attacks and the war on Gaza was a major inflection point, but the tension has only grown since then. So do you think we are at a point where we are reaching a tipping point, a breaking point of some kind?
I am very concerned, and I agree totally with Frank about the importance of this relationship. They are and have been natural allies, but there's been a shift, and it's not just because of Erdogan and Netanyahu per se. For example, the Israelis have been providing military support to Cyprus as well as to Greece, which is, as far as Turkey is concerned, interfering in their backyard. In addition to the Syrian situation where Israel seems to be undermining the al-Shara regime, which Turkey believes it was essential and responsible for helping to bring about an end to the Assad regime, Israel is undermining the stability of the al-Shara regime, according to Turkey. Then you have a situation where the two countries are throwing acrimonious accusations back and forth with each other. I mean, just the other day, the Israelis decided to recognize Armenian genocide for the first time since that accusation first flared up since Israel became a country in 1948. Well, there's another reason for that. Netanyahu is up for re-election. He considers Turkey and Erdogan wanting to interfere in Gaza, wanting to undermine Israel's regional hegemony initiatives with Lebanon against Hezbollah. And also, Israel wants to finish a war that the United States hasn't wanted to finish in Iran, and Turkey doesn't want to see that happen.
Well, let's tick through some of those that you mentioned, and let's dive into Syria, Ambassador Ricciardone. There was this flare-up last week with the Israelis striking this air base in northern Syria, which the Israelis said the Turks were going to set up a permanent presence and send troops there. Syria has denied that they were going to allow Turkey to do that. But what do you make of that episode?
Answering this question and going back to your other one, as to why Erdogan may be easier for the United States to work with than with Netanyahu with respect to regional stability and that. Ambassador Marc in Ankara has said regarding that.
The American ambassador to Turkiye, who's also the special envoy to Syria.
Correct. He has said that that Israeli strike was unnecessary at best.
Surprisingly critical for an American ambassador.
Surprisingly critical and quite interesting. It is not often that an American president or American diplomats publicly criticize Israel. In the case of Syria and its role in the regional stability, the United States and Turkey are much more aligned with respect to trying to see what the Shara government might be able to do to stabilize the country than Netanyahu. Netanyahu has consistently rejected the advice of successive American presidents and secretaries of state, utterly supportive American leaders from both parties, and sometimes in an almost rude and obnoxious way. President Erdogan, former Prime Minister Erdogan, as the head of state and of government of a NATO ally, has not behaved that way. We've had our differences, of course. I've lived them, but we're always able to discuss them either quietly or even manage them publicly in the way that you would expect allies to be able to do. That hasn't usually been the way that Prime Minister Netanyahu has dealt with successive presidents, including this one, who has proven his bona fides with respect to support for Israel, and expects in return a certain degree of respect for that, and hasn't necessarily received it.
So was this a he said, she said over the strikes on this base? I mean, do you think the Syrians would allow the Turks to have some kind of more significant presence in the northern part of their country? Was Israel lashing out at something that they really saw?
I think Israel is lashing out at something that is not inherently threatening to them, but for whatever reason, they may believe it is inherently threatening, or a portion of the Israeli public opinion, led by Netanyahu, may believe that. And at any rate, it's politically useful for them to portray themselves as surrounded by an enemy yet there. That is not useful to U.S. interests in seeing regional stability, especially that part of it that's focused on Syria. There ought to be opportunity there to stabilize things.
So that base up in the north, well away from the southern border with Israel. We have Israel occupying part of southern Syria. Ambassador Ginsberg, the U.S. would like to see the Israelis and the Syrians strike a deal. There have been conversations. How likely do you think a deal is? And to what extent do you think the Israelis will actually pull out of southern Syria?
Well, count me in as someone who's been very critical of Netanyahu's approach to Syria. You don't always choose who's going to wind up being your next door neighbor, but al-Shara is a hell of a lot better than Bashar al-Assad when it comes to essentially trying to transform Syria. The Syrian government wants to develop reasonable ties with Israel. Tom Barrack, the envoy, has done his best to try to construct some tripartite deal with the United States, Syria, and Israel. He's even suggested that Syria, including Trump, said Syria could involve itself in supporting Israel's efforts in Lebanon against Hezbollah, which the Israelis were totally against. What is going on here is something far more diabolical. The Israelis do not consider the al-Shah regime to be long for the world. They think in the end it will not survive. They're afraid that in the end Turkey will be the dominant force inside Syria. And as long as Erdogan is in power, and by the way, they fear the successor to Erdogan more than they fear Erdogan. The Israelis are calculating that the current foreign minister is going to wind up becoming the next president, and he has been, or shown his bona fide. He's also the former head of intelligence, that his bona fides are totally anti-Israel, and he considers Israel to be a threat to Turkey's long-term interest in the region, far more of a threat than Erdogan does.
How much do you think, Ambassador Ricciardone, that Trump needs Erdogan when it comes to Hamas? The Turks and Hamas have a relatively close relationship. We've seen Hamas officials living and working in Turkey. So how much is Erdogan needed by the Trump administration to get Hamas to where the U.S. wants them to be, that is, disarming and giving up governance in Gaza?
From what I can see, the United States, I wouldn't say needs, but very much appreciates the Turkish ability to communicate with, deal with Hamas. Someone needs to be able to do that.
Along the lines of Egypt and Qatar, or is it more specialized?
Along those lines, but well, Egypt has direct geographic, physical access. Turkey has the next best thing in the presence of Hamas leaders there and a lot of influence on them. Qatar has its own ways of being helpful. I'd say all three of those are useful, but it's not so much the United States that needs it, or Turkey that needs it, or Egypt, or Qatar. It's Netanyahu. For Israel to find its way out of its bind, the instant bind with Hamas and solving that, or I would argue the larger one, it is stuck with rejecting a two-state solution, which, by the way, has been the advice of successive American presidents explicitly since George W. Bush, implicitly since Carter, at least. They reject a two-state solution. That leaves a one-state solution if you want to be the Jewish state and a democracy and one state. What do you do with all those Palestinians? Mm-hmm. What do you do with them? And who do you, if you're not going to let them develop their own credible, autonomous polity to speak for them, let them, nurture them, help them, don't trick them, oppose them, oppress them, so that they have a weak representative. And then the Hamases emerge. It was Netanyahu himself who promoted Hamas in public statements when he was criticized for letting Qatari funding go to them.
Before October 7th.
Before October 7th, he said, those who, like me, oppose the formation of a Palestinian state will necessarily support me in allowing the funding to go to Hamas.
Yeah, to pit Hamas and the PA against each other.
So I would say it is Netanyahu himself, it is Israel that needs a channel to deal with Hamas. And it should be a friend like the United States. We don't have direct ability to deal with them. We have a NATO ally that is clearly a friend of ours, a treaty ally of ours, has never shown a belligerent intent against Israel. Yes, angry language back and forth over specific conflicts, but never sought to occupy, has never made a war against Israel. This action in Syria doesn't portend to me any Turkish interest in expansionism.
Right.
It's just not been in their DNA since the republic was founded.
I'm glad you mentioned that they're a NATO ally, because the strength of Turkiye's military is a bone of contention. It is a cause for concern for the Israelis. Turkiye has the second largest army in NATO. Only the U.S. is more powerful. And President Erdogan is trying to make his military stronger, buying more firepower with the F-35 fighter jets from the United States. That has been in motion for quite some time, but he's been blocked from doing so because Turkiye also operates the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. The U.S. says that is a security risk, and they were sanctioned for that. So a couple weeks ago, Ambassador Ginsberg, in Ankara, during the NATO summit, we heard President Trump indicating that he was willing to sell the Turks the F-35. Do you think that that's going to happen?
I think that's I mean, if he doesn't need to go to Congress, which he needs to do. I mean, Netanyahu's opposition, vociferous opposition to this potential sale, is based on a variety of issues, and Netanyahu, is doing what he can to try to leverage whatever remaining support Israel has in Congress to try to block this sale. Can and would the Senate and the House block this sale under these circumstances? Given the standing that Israel right now doesn't enjoy in the Congress, there's a good chance that this F-35 deal would go through, and I'm sure that the president and his team will find a way to circumvent Congress the way they've circumvented Congress on a variety of issues involving arms sales to allies.
I know you're not a former general, but you're a smart man. To what extent do you think that would actually shift the military balance of power, which is Netanyahu's major concern?
Well, the problem is that the only country in the Middle East that currently has F-35s is Israel. So to give F-35s to another country that Israel right now considers to be a potential military adversary, let alone geopolitical adversary, for the Israelis, that's a threat. They would rather not see that sale occur rather than permit it to occur.
Another perhaps smaller thing that the Israelis might have seen as a threat is Tom Barrack, who we've mentioned. He talked about the Golan Heights being occupied by Israel. And you'll remember that in the first Trump term, President Trump recognized that as Israeli sovereignty. Was that, Ambassador, just a slip up, or do you think that speaks to perhaps deeper divisions in the Trump administration?
I can't speak to divisions in the Trump administration. Tom Barrack knows the area well. He knows its history. I have to believe he spoke intentionally. The rest of the world recognizes the Golan as occupied territory. Mm-hmm. Legally, technically, it remains occupied territory. Mm-hmm. So he was only stating a matter of fact. What that means in terms of internal I doubt that there was a meeting about this ahead of time within the administration where they sent this out as some kind of signal.
Well, he backtracked on it really quite very. I mean, look, the problem here, quickly, Alex, is that Israel occupies a small portion of the Golan Heights, which wasn't occupied by Israel before the overthrow of the Assad regime. Mm-hmm. So if you want to give Ambassador Barrack the benefit of the doubt, he may have been referring to that. I think Barrack is playing, shall we say, his own game out there, and we have to keep an eye on what his game is up to.
Yeah, he did walk it back very quickly. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Let's talk about Syria and money, because the U.S. has, over the course of the past few months, lifted sanctions on the Syrian government so that they can get their feet under them and get their economy running. And there was this great video the other day of Shara using a Visa card in Damascus, which was quite remarkable. And then just a couple days ago, the designation that they were a state sponsor of terror was also lifted, which is quite significant. However, the Syrian government still desperate for investment. The World Bank estimates it's going to take some $216 billion to rebuild the country. That includes $82 billion for critical infrastructure. And then there's security. The government wants to double its military personnel to 200,000 people within 5 years. So, Ambassador Ginsberg, Syria needs a huge amount of financial help. Is Washington going to pony up? Are they getting others to do the same?
I think there's a great sensitivity in Washington to the benefit of the new Syrian government. There's a will on the part of Congress as well as the administration to see this regime succeed. No matter what the Israelis say, there is a belief across the board, Democrat and Republican, that al-Shara, so far, his actions, other than the sectarian violence that has occurred in the Suwaida province against the Druze, which is a big deal to the Israelis, that he has shown a great deal of leadership and willingness to hold, for example, the Assad regime accountable. Just over the last few months, there's been the convictions of Assad cronies and accountability that al-Shara promised that has given more faith and confidence to the Syrian people than just about anything else he needs. Now, look, this administration keeps cutting foreign aid. I don't know how you're going to square the needle. Square the needle? Thread the needle. That's mixed metaphors. Square the circle on finding additional funding other than encouraging Arab states to invest more inside both Syria as well as Lebanon.
Right. Tomorrow is 6 months since Israel and the United States launched this war. Israel would like to see more military action against Iran. The Turks, of course, would like to see a diplomatic path. We've seen the Trump administration the past few days really step up the economic measures against Iran. How, Ambassador Ricciardone, does Trump balance those competing interests from those two countries, or does he not care at all? And on this issue, he's just thinking about the U.S. interests?
I have to imagine that when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, he cares about the U.S. interest above all. And right now, the clear goal, the main goal, maybe the only one, of this war and the negotiations and the financial pressures has to be restoration of the status quo ante with respect to the Straits. That is, the free flow of goods through the Straits without tithing the Iranians with that. That must be it. And I don't see that the Israeli and the antagonism between Israel and Turkey is directly germane to that. It's a nuisance. It's a distraction. It doesn't help, but neither one is really directly able to help in that, I think.
President Trump told Al Jazeera just yesterday that he didn't really have a timetable. He's willing to let the economic measures take their course. And of course, that's going to run right up against his domestic political calendar with midterms coming in just a few months' time. Ambassadors, thank you both very much for joining me. Ambassador Frank Ricciardone, who's the former ambassador to Turkiye and Egypt, and Ambassador Marc Ginsberg, former ambassador to Morocco. Appreciate it. And that's all from the team here in Washington. We'll be back on Friday with a special look at the state of the war in Iran 6 months after it was launched by the U.S. and Israel. That'll be at 18:30 GMT or 2:30 p.m. Eastern here in the United States. I want to hand it back now to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.